world. One person, however, disagreed with this idea on the panel. He was Admiral Forrestal. Some of you may have heard of him. Great naval hero. And what happened was he said he thought the American people were ready for this, and he was going to go public with it. Because of that, he was immediately confined to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and after his family started to try and get him released, he was suicided, or as we now say, Arkansized, by flying out the window of his hospital room with a sheet around his neck, and he fell 3 stories and broke his neck. So this is dangerous stuff. This is deadly stuff. And at this point, they began to work on this project of misinformation. What seems to have happened next is that in the mid-50s, a treaty was allegedly entered into between the United States government, President Eisenhower, and the UFO people. They signed a treaty, and this was the terms of the treaty, that the United States would be gradually given UFO technology. In exchange for this, the UFO people would be given the right to prey upon the American people, abduct us, experiment on us, and then put us back, as long as they didn't kill anybody. What a deal, huh? So after that, many sightings continued to happen, and the craft were coming in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I mean, this is a kind of a collage of what these UFOs were looking like. And some of them were quite extraordinary sightings. At one point, there were hundreds of them flying over the Capitol. They were simultaneously sighted by aircraft, land observers, and radar. Now, that's pretty hard to do unless you're looking at something that's real. Also, at one point, astronomers at Mount Palomar, which is one of the most celebrated telescopes, I think it's the world's largest reflecting telescope out in California, saw more than 1,000 UFOs fly over the moon, and they picked them up on the telescope. There have literally been sightings by literally hundreds of trained observers, pilots, military pilots, astronomers, you name it, people that ought to know what's going on up in the sky. Now, remember about this treaty. As a result of this treaty, we began to have a new kind of close encounter. For your information, there's now 4 kinds that have been classified. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer from Northwestern University, and he was asked by the Air Force to run their Project Blue Book, which was their little cover-up thing for many years. He came up with the first 3. Close encounter of the first kind was seeing a UFO up close in the sky. Close encounter of the second kind was if the UFO landed and produced some kind of physical evidence of its being there. In other words, burn marks on the ground, like maybe the prints of a landing gear, or perhaps some radioactive residue. Close encounter of the third kind is when the UFO lands and you see or communicate with an alien. And close encounter of the fourth kind is what we're now going to talk about. The first time that this happened that we know of was in 1961. Interestingly enough, just a few years after the treaty supposedly took place. This was a couple named Betty and Barney Hill. And they were driving through the deserted highways of New Hampshire late at night, and they lost 4 or 5 hours of time. At the time, they were just bewildered by it. They'd seen some lights in the sky, but didn't think much of it. But afterwards, they began to have a lot of emotional problems, nightmares. They went to a therapist. They were hypnotized, which we don't recommend, by the way. But as a result of that, they had memories of being taken aboard this craft and having all sorts of invasive medical procedures done to them. This caused a sensation. They wrote a book called Interrupted Journey, which you see here, and it was a bestseller. And it created a whole new genre, if you will, of UFO activity. Since that time, thousands and thousands of people report being abducted. Now, some of them are copycats. Some of them are Fruit Loops, clinically speaking. Some of them are genuine. And this is a very disturbing phenomenon which I believe the church cannot and must not ignore. The interesting thing about this encounter, which lent it some validity, is that this woman, while she was on the craft under hypnosis, she reported seeing a star chart. She drew this star chart, and it was told to her by the aliens that this is their home star system, Zeta Reticuli. Now that's a real star system. And the trouble is it didn't look right. And so the experts just sort of went, ha-ha, you know, and they poo-pooed it. But just in very recent years, we've had the computer ability to take star systems and three-dimensionally move them around to see what they look like from other directions. And what some enterprising individual discovered is that that would be what the Zeta Reticuli star system looked like if, in fact, it was viewed from that planet and not from Earth. Now, how do you explain that? Two explanations are possible. One is she was really on board an alien craft. The other is she got the image from a demon, because demons do a lot of traveling. So, what's going on with these? Well, real briefly, people seem to be accosted by a UFO in a fairly isolated setting. They are somehow tranquilized, they're unable to move, they're rendered submissive, and they're taken aboard a ship, often through a levitation beam. The people on board the ship usually are described as looking like the alien that I just showed you. They're very short, 3 to 4 feet tall, big heads, huge eyes, no genitals, vestigial mouth and nose and ears. In other words, not very much of those in evidence. And they stink. They smell like sulfur. Interesting smell. Anyway, blood and other bodily fluids are usually extracted from the human people by weird devices. There's a lot of interest in the person's reproductive system. Quite often, these things are taken, sperm or ova are taken from the person, and then they are let back to where they are. They are returned to where they were found, sometimes hours later, sometimes even days later. And the problem with this also is that sometimes women get pregnant as a result of these encounters. Sometimes the babies vanish. Sometimes they're carried to term and then they're whisked away by doctors, and the woman is never allowed to see them. And the end result is that they are told that it's stillborn. These women often have dreams later on in which they are taken aboard the ship and see their child, and it's an alien-human hybrid. So, sometimes these people, after they are returned, if they start telling stories about what has happened to them, they are hassled by the dreaded MIBs, the men in black. These are men that are dressed entirely in black. They often look Asian in appearance. They drive outdated black Cadillacs in perfect condition. They talk in a metallic monotone, and they threaten these people with various forms of harm and even death if they continue to speak. Okay. Now, the other thing you need to know is that essentially there's 3 kinds of these aliens reported. There's the Greys, which are the little guys that I showed you the picture of. There's the Nordics, and these are the ones that look like us, except better. They're beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, god or goddess-like figures with incredibly perfect builds, and they look totally human, except maybe they look a little too good to be true, except for the fact that they are seen in the company of the Greys or other aliens on board UFOs, which makes them seem weird. The third kind, which are the more disturbing kind, are what are called the reptoids, or the draconians. These supposedly come from the star constellation Draco, which oddly enough means dragon in Latin. And they look like reptiles. They look like humanoid reptiles. They're 6 to 7 feet tall with alligator-like heads. And they apparently are said to have the ability to shape shift, that's hard to say, and appear to be human for brief periods of time, except that their eyes still look reptilian.